Hey everyone, James from TDB here bringing you another Inbetweenisode. Today I am sipping on some ripe tea, but not going to be talking about that, just going to be talking a bit about a different topic, a famous aged tea, and try to talk about why it's relevant and how it kind of has its fingerprints on kind of the contemporary scene we see, partly because, we do buy aged cakes when we are doing this, although I strongly suspect it will be a very small minority of people that ever buy any of these cakes or get to try them, but just talk about how it has influenced kind of the different eras of raw pu'erh that we do have access to. So yeah, this is a post that I did on TDB2, very related to this as well. So yeah, I am not a historian, just to caveat things properly, but I am a tea fan, and so I do come across certain knowledge, so I'm going to do my very best to sum it up. But if there is something I get wrong or anything like that, feel free to chime in on the comments below, and just let me know, because yeah, doing my best here. So going to be starting with kind of this era in the 80s and the 90s, called the Cheese-Bing era. And so this is where we have teas that are explicitly Manghai Tea Factory, Shaoguan especially. And so I would say those two factories kind of dominate the well-known teas of the era. Not to say other factories weren't pressing tea, but most things that are very well-known are recipe blends. So from those two factories, you start to see a lot of the numbered things like 7542, 8582, 7532, 8653. And there's some particularly famous batches of those, things like the 1999 Iron Cake 8653. You could argue that's kind of in a newer era, but stuff like that, I think 1996, 7532 Snowmark, 1985, 8592, the Purple Cloud, I think is what that one's called, and then most notably the 7542 Productions. So the main one I want to talk about is the 88 Qingbing, partly because that's the one that's most referenced today. So what exactly does that mean? Because it is partly misleading. So it's a little unusual in the sense that it's not referring to a specific production, but also the storage of the cakes. So at the time, and continuing through pretty much this whole era, the dominant form of storage was kind of this Hong Kong traditional storage, resulting in tea that gets aged fairly fast or matured fairly fast and just kind of ready to drink. Again, in this era, these teas are not considered kind of matte, fancy boutique things with like nice labeling and things like that. Very much kind of like workman-like teas, even the ones that are highly, highly sought after today. So the 88 Qingbing kind of went counter to that. Rather than doing Hong Kong traditional storage, it was Hong Kong dry storage. So still Hong Kong storage, but kind of veering a little bit away from what the average was. So most famously, a lot of these were stored by Vesper Chan, but you can find people that have 88 Qingbing that's not stored by him too, that stored them themselves, people like Sue. So what exactly is that? So it's dry stored, that's important, but it's also multiple batches of 7542. So we're talking about teas from 1989 all the way to 1992. So this means there's a fair amount of variance within them, partly because of the storage, and you can even have variation within the same storage too, as well as just was this particular batch good quality. Like one of the batches could be like the first batch of 1989 7542 versus like the last batch of 1992 7542. There could be a significant quality difference within them. So that's why when we talk about variance and stuff like that, this is certainly something to keep in mind. And moving backwards, we have this Yinji era from the, this is basically kind of from the late 40s, maybe 50s, 60s, into the 70s. So this is where you will definitely have these factories that were still active in the Cheese-Bing era, so Manghai, Shaoguan, Kunming Tea Factory as well, but they aren't explicitly from the factory. So you have things like Red Mark, Blue Mark, Yellow Mark. Red Mark is probably the most famous and sought after, Blue Mark a little bit after that, and it kind of gave way eventually to the era that I was just talking about. And usually the teas in this era are specified in decades rather than years. Again, teas were not particularly precious at the time, so people were not overly fixated on a certain batch or blend. If they knew what the future would hold, they certainly would have paid more attention to things, but people were not thinking about at that time. So again, these are again, all blends and mostly all big factory pressings. The area that these recipes are coming from, especially Munghai tea factories, most likely the Munghai area. People argue about Iwu, but I think the general consensus is that Iwu did make its way into some of these blends from the 50s and 60s, and then tea production eventually stopped in the 70s. This is documented a little bit in that Zhang Jihong book, Pu'erh Tea, Ancient Caravans and Urban Chic. Okay, so yeah, very, very significant era too, but you can sort of see how this directly carries over into the Chiza Bing era. So these teas, as you can expect, are even more expensive than those, and just about all of them have undergone some sort of traditional storage early on. If you find someone that's selling like a 1950s dry stored red mark, it should ring a ton of alarm bells all over the place. Okay, so the final era I wanted to talk about is the Haoji era. So this is the era that predates that. So we're talking pre-World War II. And it's interesting because a lot of the labels at this time were smaller, so they weren't necessarily the big factories. A lot of the big factories formed after the war. And so this is where you have the famous tea mountains that got famous, so things like Yola, Mengzhi, Yibang, Gedeng, Manzhuan, and Mancha. And it's also why when the Taiwanese kind of came into Yunnan in the 90s, when things were opening up, again referenced in the Zhongji Hong book, they went for these areas. And they found that the production had more or less stopped at a certain point. And so what does this all mean? Well, I guess a couple of the brands you'll see here are Songpin Hao and Tongqing Hao. So as we kind of ushered into this more contemporary era of Pu'erh in the late 90s and into the 2000s, what happened? Well, people basically ate the shit out of kind of the historical things. So the Songpin Hao from like the 2000s basically becomes meaningless. The red marks become meaningless if you're talking about kind of red mark from the 2000s. It could be anything at that point. You shouldn't see these as historic relatives to the earlier cakes. People were just marketing what they could, and what people knew was like these different labels. For a stretch there, 7542 and 8582 meant very little because people, non-factories that were not even Munghai Tea Factory, were making those same sorts of productions and just slapping that label on it. It could have been an honest attempt to recreate it, but most likely very not. So you should take all those labels with a strong grain of salt. So, and so again, the recipes and things like that did again become a little bit more relevant as Munghai Tea Factory cracked down and basically said, okay, so you should pay attention to if it's a Dai's 7542 or a Zhongcha 7542, because the Zhongcha 7542 could have been made by anyone. The Dai 7542 is made by Dai. So you should treat it with a little more, you should treat those two things differently, because one is made by the factory. Not to say that the Dai one is going to be identical to like the 88 Qingbing recipes or anything like that. Just that one is made by the actual creator there. And you'll also notice here that Iwu, the 6 famous tea mountains, those are all mountains that are known and marketed today. And in fact, if you look at kind of the contemporary era, those were some of the earliest different mountains to get marketed and well known. And since then, the kind of Mansa County, where kind of the basic greater Iwu area is, has been broken down so many different villages and gardens and things like that. So those are just some ways that kind of the historical eras have influenced where we are here. And without those eras, I think we would probably be in a fairly different place as far as Pu'erh is concerned. And it's also where you can kind of see kind of the modern practices of smaller factories and more boutique operations is really kind of descended from that Haoji era too. Or you could see it as a descendant of that. So right now we kind of have like the big factories who are still doing their thing. You can see the clear descendants of that from Inji and Chiza Bing. And you have smaller boutique labels, which are all kinds of things and certainly look very different than they did 100 years ago, but are also doing their thing and kind of promoting these smaller growing areas. Okay, thank you for tuning in to this episode. Let me know if you enjoyed it. I will see you all next time. Cheers.